I like this question quite a lot from Joshua Tiemens, and he says, is there anything you admire about Russian or Chinese culture? Really glad I got that, because sometimes I talk, so much about threats and problems and stuff that I never get to talk about the stuff that I do admire. And needless to say, yeah, there's a lot that I admire about Russian or Chinese culture. Let's start with Chinese culture, because I can probably do more on Russian culture. The first thing I would say I admire about Chinese culture is their work ethic. They work like animals. They work like Americans used to work. The Chinese work ethic is unbelievable. And most Americans, if an average American had to do the kind of a job and put in a kind of a week that the average Chinese worker has to put in, they just would drop dead. I think they just drop dead from exhaustion or depression or fear. I mean, the fact that many Chinese are killing themselves is an indication that they're working too hard. But they have a tremendous work ethic. They have a tremendous sense of internal pride and pride in their culture, which I respect very much. I'm a big American patriot. I love this country. I think it's the greatest country in the history of the world. And people hear that and they say, so you must hate it when a Brit says Britain's the greatest country in the world, or Chinese person says China's the greatest country in the world. That must really make you awfully mad. Huh? It's like, no, on the contrary, I understand it completely. I completely get it. Makes me mad when they don't say that. I completely get it. So I think China has a tremendous work ethic. I think China has an ancient culture, and China has a very deep connection to its own identity, which I happen to think is their weakness. I read a profoundly simple, very simple, but profoundly illuminating dissection of kind of the cultural difference between China and the United States, and basically said China is a largely landlocked nation. I mean, they got a huge coast, right? But they're not a maritime nation. China is a nation of farmers with an army that looks inward, and America is a nation of traders with a navy that looks outward. That we are a trading nation, a nation of business people who like to do exchanges, and we live on the oceans because that way we can increase commerce. Commerce is highly competitive. Commerce is highly fluid and dynamic, and commerce is based on invention and all that other stuff. And China is much more on a farming kind of a basis and a much more internal landlocked kind of basis. That was really profound. I think it's really true. There are many things I admire about Russian culture. I don't admire their alcoholism, and I don't admire their meanness, and I don't admire the brutality of the Russian culture. And there's a lot of it there. You have to say, of course, that so much of the kindness and so much of the decency and so much of the gentleness of Russian culture has simply been taken out and shot or starved to death by first the Tsars and then the Bolsheviks. They just simply murdered all the decent people, and you do that for 4 or 5 generations, you're going to have an effect. I think the thing I like most about Russians to this day is they're very large-souled people. And maybe it's because I run like that myself, a very big, passionate guy, and I admire the Russian depth of feeling. And now you can start making some claims against America, which are legitimate claims when you're talking about Russia and America. The Russian people, traditionally anyway, have an incredible appreciation for literature and especially poetry, which I admire very much. They're a people not only of very deep emotions, but they're people of very deep passions and people who seem to be very concerned with ideas. With that said, I think it's the American sense of practicality that makes us what we are and what I like so much about it. The Bolshevik Revolution and all of the murder that went on as a result of that was a revolution of intellectuals. And I distrust intellectuals enormously, because I see what they do. When you let the people who think that they're the smartest people in the room run things, it gets really ugly, really fast. But the idea that they're so passionate about ideas and music and poetry and things like that says a lot about them. So the giant contradiction really in the Russian character, isn't it, is that people who could be so moved by literature and poetry and all of these kind of very deep, advanced sort of cultural traits could be so brutal, just so brutal. And I think a lot of it is just due to the fact that they've had hundreds and thousands of years, really, thousands of years of fear. Fear of the Tsar, and fear of the communists, and fear of the Soviet power, and fear of the secret police, and fear of disappearing, fear of the gulags, fear. No wonder they're all so alcoholic over there. It's a great tragedy, really, when you think about it. They make terrific, I think, theoretical scientists because their commitment to the intellect, they're tremendous theoretical scientists, the Russians. I think their engineering is poor. I think their engineering is poor because the economic catastrophe of socialism means that they never ever had the means to put actual capital into the hands of their best minds, because we did in the West, especially in America, and because we were putting actual capital and letting our best minds do what they did best. It turned out that Russian engineering and Russian mechanical skills were basically reverse engineering. They were taking American airplanes and taking them apart. And all you have to do is make this case all day. You look at the Russian space shuttle compared to the American space shuttle. If you are not an expert, they're indistinguishable. Oh, well, that's just an accident. Not even an accident. That was the only design that would have worked. Well, nonsense. Don't be ridiculous. The B-1 and the Blackjack, the Concorde and the Tu-144. The very first case of this, really with the B-29 and was it the Russian B-2, B something or other. Anyway, no, because we allowed money and freedom into the hands of our best brains, we were so far ahead of them in engineering talent that all they could do was break down our stuff and reverse it in order to try to catch up, and I think that crippled them terribly. But I personally like the Russians much better than I like the Chinese, just personal taste, as a general rule. And just to get this out on the table, I like the Japanese far better than I like the Russians, and I'm speaking in as general terms as you can get now. And I think that if this question had been what do I admire about Japanese culture, I could go on and on and on and on and on. I think the Japanese culture is so superior to the Chinese culture in so many ways. There's so much. There's a great deal that I don't like about Asian culture in general, but the counterbalancing aspects of Japanese culture to me are so much higher than they are of Chinese culture. And now that I've managed to offend everybody, let's just go on, and I think maybe we'll do, what are you telling me? We may do one more, maybe two more, and then we'll call it a night.